Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint. As you all can see, I have with me the foremost, if I may, in my words, Indo Pacific expert, Miss Cleo Paskal. I follow her very keenly. She's got some insights with regards to the Indo Pacific, which you don't find around the place. Although this region has not been spoken about much, especially in the Indian discourse, because we find it too far away, but we need to learn with what's happening there, even if we are not wanting to get involved. Thank you so much for joining me, Cleo, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you and learn from you.
Oh, it's a pleasure for on my part, and I learned an enormous amount from your show, and it's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let me just open this up with the latest round of Chinese aggression around Taiwan right now. President Tsai Ing-wen went to US. It's not a surprise. I mean, she was supposed to go there for a while. Seemed like a late reaction from China, where they didn't think it would happen, but it's probably happened. And the aggressiveness is there. But do you think it's like a very plateaued response from China this time?
I think that China's going to do what China's going to do, and it'll use the actions of others as a kind of PR excuse for whatever it wants to do. Like, for example, when Pelosi went to Taiwan and they had all of that activity afterwards, that sort of activity takes a long time to put in place. So I expect they would have been preparing for a while, and the Pelosi visit just gave them an excuse to do this sort of bracketing that they wanted to do. Similarly, in this case, they'll use it as an excuse to do whatever trials they wanted to do anyway. But if this wouldn't have happened, they would have found another reason to do it. They're on track. They're pushed through the median line. Um, they they're going to eventually be going over the island. Um, whatever we do, we kind of the rest of the world is just going to be worked into their script, but the script is already largely written, they would like to think.
That's a dangerous scenario that you've just put out. The the Chinese at this moment, with their economic distress within the country, of course, the amount of efforts that they're putting into revive, although there is some revival, but of course they now come around and say that their growth is not going to be 2.5%. It's marginal. Uh, they would need a diversion at this point of time. They would need to get attention away from them. How do you think they will do that? North Korea is one example that comes to mind, but is that even, I mean, is it a valid sort of an argument to give? Because I really personally feel that the Chinese now realize that as the Ukraine war, they, at least there's some talks of peace and they're next on the menu if they don't kind of divert the West somewhere else. So is the Chinese now trying to create diversionary activities where to get the West involved with something else to keep them away from themselves?
It could be. I mean, they're pretty good at using proxies, and using their they're not really allies. A country like that doesn't have friends, to try to, as you say, kind of pull attention away from what they're doing. Um, I think that they're hoping that Ukraine goes on for a while longer. So and it's just incredible to me to see, for example, Macron going to um, China and asking China to help solve the problem China of Ukraine. China has no interest in solving the problem in Ukraine, and in the same way, it has no interest in solving the problem in North Korea. If they wanted to solve that problem, then they could have shut that country down a long time ago. It's not necessarily that they have complete control over Pyongyang. It's that they have control to do damage. They might not be able to positively direct it exactly what to do, but they can certainly do the country a lot of damage, which gives it some sort of leverage. I think that the Kims have shown that they will try to do their own thing if they can, and they're also quite close to Moscow. And it also helps Moscow to create this kind of a diversion in another theater. Um, So it's hard to know what percentage of North Korea's activities can be attributed to Beijing, but it certainly doesn't hurt Beijing for as many fires to be started uh, that the rest of the world has to try to put out as possible.
Is China trying to change its image? Let me just ask you succinctly.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
I think it as you see with kind of this idea that China is the solution to the Ukraine problem, which is just insane, of course, because China's keeping the Ukraine issue going through um, uh, currency swaps, buying stuff from Russia, giving political cover to Russia, all that sort of stuff. I think that it likes to confuse the narrative, and it's incredible to me that that again that the French take would accept this. So I have to think there's something else going on. I mean, I can't. It's not possible that the French, with all of their understanding of the Indo Pacific, which is substantial, uh, wouldn't see what you and I are seeing in terms of the way that China is acting to support Russia and Ukraine very actively. Weapons transfers, financial buying stuff. So there must be something going on. So the management of the image of China seems to have a lot of complicity among some sectors in the West, and you see it also in the U.S. on things like climate change, where um, some in the U.S. administration are seem to try to say that China's you have to work with China because it's a solution. It'll be the solution to climate change. It'll help us with climate change. That plays into China's narrative that, first of all, the Chinese Communist Party can be reasoned with and will make concessions even if it hurts its own interests for the sake of some Western goal. Although in this case they say it's a global goal, but I'm not sure China buys it. Not only are they trying to manage their perception of their own narrative, but there seems to be quite a lot of complicity around the world with others who I would have thought would know better to promote the narrative that China is pushing about itself. I don't understand it. I think that the man or woman on the street seems to have a better sense of what China is and what the Chinese Communist Party is um, than is being pushed in the media, at least the media in the West, and by a lot of the diplomatic corps worldwide.
it's astounding, as a matter of fact, when you're mentioning it, and you put it out very lightly about European this thing. To me, I mean, and I'm not trying to contradict you, but it's astounding for the European Union president and the president of France to go there in a way that they are literally, and I'm going to use the word, I'm sorry if it sounds rude, begging Xi Jinping to intervene within Ukraine. That shows a level of desperation in on part of Europe I've not seen. Uh, how does China interpret something like this?
Weakness, it's I don't. I mean, not only did the French go. I mean, they're talking about Ukraine, but they brought a huge business delegation. I mean, this is a country that the U.S. government has put on the record as being as committing genocide. I mean, I don't understand it. This regime in China is doing horrific things to its own citizens at a enormous and systematic scale. And apart from everything it's doing to everybody else. So I find it, not just strategically problematic, to be polite, but also completely immoral. I mean, this is not a regime that should be begged, as you put it, but also supported or being seen in public with. I mean, there's, I'm, I, this is a bad regime that, you know, takes political prisoners and while they're alive cuts them open and sells their organs to people who, come on for for specifically for that. They kill people on order to rip out their organs and sell them. I mean, apart from everything else they do, you know, I don't understand how that's the sort of government you think you can, appeal to their better angels on in order to help you with something that's your priority. It's just makes me a little bit sick. So I don't know. I don't know what they think they're going to get out of it, but they're not going to get anything out of it that China doesn't want, which means that doesn't strengthen China. So the only thing that they're going to do by going there is strengthening China, the Chinese Communist Party. It's not a good sign of the times.
That's the least said, if I may. Uh, let's move to the Indo-Pacific. Last time we spoke, there was a huge challenge brewing up in the Solomons. The president of Micronesia wrote a letter, which was very well noted all around the world, and I think that particular letter echoed uh, a whole lot about Chinese aggressiveness than was pretty much mentioned by any head of state till then. Uh, no head of state has come out and said the stuff that he said. But somewhere down the line, I fail to understand why the West kind of brushed that thing down. It wasn't picked up in the media as hard as it should have been. It wasn't spoken about all over the place. There were no theses, books, or talk shows, nothing. It was quiet. Why are a lot of the West, we see, when in India we start talking about this, we don't have a standing in the Indo Pacific. Uh, but the West, which has interests in the Indo Pacific, is letting go of these things which are happening. That scares me a little bit with regards the focus that they keep talking about, that the pivot to Asia and all sorts of things. Is there really something like that?
Yeah, well, I think India does have standing. I'm not,
Yeah, I
India
mean,
has, as we've discussed, a lot of challenges on its own border already. So not to put more on India's shoulders, but actually India has a unique credibility in the region. A lot of these countries are post-colonial countries,
hmm,
and India has been a part of the region for millennia. You see little pieces of India or Indian culture spread throughout the region. I mean, you have Buddhism that made it to Japan, and Hinduism that's made it to Indonesia. You have the traces of the spice route. You have the Thai kings that have the word Rama in their title. It's all you have in South Korea. You have the kind of
South Indian princess.
that's right. It's so in India is all over, and in fact, in a way that uh, China, is quite jealous of because it pretends to have been all over, but India actually was, and in a deep cultural way. So India does have standing. It doesn't. It doesn't use it as much as it could, and it's going to be a challenge because what happens in the Pacific Ocean isn't going to stay in the Pacific Ocean, which I think is why you're going to why Prime Minister Modi is heading to Papua New Guinea. I think in May. I think it's going to probably be May. Um, uh, and why Jay Shankar was in Fiji not that long ago, because the oceans are linked, and once if the Chinese consolidate in the Pacific, part of the goal then is to link that into some of the consolidation that's been happening in the Indian Ocean, as like Sri Lanka, like they tried in Maldives, like they're trying in Seychelles, and of course they already have the base in Djibouti. So it kind of strings across. Um, but you asked specifically about this letter. Now the letter is, as you said, is I've never seen anything like it. It's 13 pages long, and most of it is a detailed description of Chinese political warfare assaults on the country of Micronesia. And he includes things that we know the Chinese do to pretty much every target country, including funding separatist organizations, buying off politicians, um, trying to subvert the political process, personally threatening the president himself for trying to resist the Chinese encroachment. It's a remarkable letter, but the the kick is in the last couple pages where he says, and that's why I would like my country to transfer diplomatic recognition from China to Taiwan. And he goes into detail about what would be required to do the transfer, because the Chinese have put money into the budget, and so if he de-recognizes China, there's a big cost. Not only is there a cost to they're taking that money out, but China blocks access for countries that recognize Taiwan in other sectors through the control they have in places like the UN. So the letter lays out the numerical amounts, $50 million over 3 years, things like that. And he says he's spoken with the foreign minister of Taiwan, Wu, about it, and there is some understanding. But that's why I think this is such an important and sensitive letter, because the narrative you talked about, China's narrative control, and the narrative control out of China has been that countries are going to leave Taiwan one after the other after the other. And so if you're one of the 13 countries that still recognizes Taiwan, you better jump ship quickly, because eventually you're going to flip and you're going to get a better deal if you do it now than if you do it later. This changes that narrative. This is a country that is saying, we want to go from China to Taiwan. So it completely upsets the Chinese narrative. If it were to happen, it would have global importance. It would say China isn't inevitable. There is another way. And the reason he wants to de-recognize China and recognize Taiwan, he says very explicitly, is because China is undermining his country's sovereignty. It's against their values. They're very core issues of identity and national sovereignty. And his case is compelling. Because we're in a phase now of political warfare, this is a real shot across the bow on the political warfare front. And he knows what he's doing. This President Panuelo, he's going to be out of office soon. He lost the last election, possibly because there were two other letters that came before this, where he was also very direct about China. And so there may have been some money going to people to get him out of power. To opposition, that would be very typical Chinese political warfare in those circumstances. But as you said, it hasn't been picked up. So if it's not picked up, and given the risk, and given the fact that China will definitely go after him, who will make this kind of a stand ever again? So yeah, the West hasn't really stood up for him, but neither has any of the other countries that say that they stand for democracy. So it could, every country helps. It could be Palau, it could be Marshall Islands, it could be India, it could be Taiwan hasn't really made a big statement. Japan hasn't made a big statement. So he's standing alone, waving the flag of freedom on the beaches of Micronesia and looking around, and there's nobody standing by his side. It's frightening and heartrending, and you're right to bring it up, and everybody should read the letter and understand what it means for him not to be getting his support.
Well, I'm not going to take anything away from Micronesia. It's a terrible situation. But when we in India look at something like that, We look at it like that, we've been going through this for decades. Nobody stood by us. We've been handling our own borders. We've had four, five, six wars. We've had terrorism from both the sides, by the way. A lot of people don't talk about the terrorism that China does in the northeastern states. They've been running an insurgency there for, God, I don't know, 60 years. It's now come to a finish. There is a big problem within India called Maoism. Guess where Mao comes from? So, a lot of expectancy, and I'm just going to focus on India for this question. I want to understand this because we in India normally criticize the Western, we call it hypocrisy because we say, we don't call anybody out when we're in trouble. You expect us to call out people when they're in trouble. Why? Why should we do that? I
Be,
want to
be,
understand the thought process. Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, because you know India, the Western model and the Chinese model, they're not equivalents. I mean, the Chinese model is clearly worse than the Western model, but the Western model is not perfect, and there is
Nothing.
yeah, and there is another way. I mean, and that's what I think India, especially under Prime Minister Modi, has tried to say is, there is another way of doing international relations. um, and you're right. Other, like, I mean, there has been quiet support for India, I'd say, through the Department of Defense for definitely more recently, especially since the last U.S. administration. Um, but Department of State has, how long does it take to get a U.S. Visa interview currently these days? I mean,
One
you
and a
know,
half years.
yeah, I mean, that's clearly wrong. But uh, you're neither would any Western country make the stand that David Panuelo in Micronesia made, right? So he's also showing a different kind of politics.
Yeah.
He's not Macron, who's going to China to try to, right. So maybe other countries can find each other and break out of this dichotomy and take the leadership position on the issues that underpin uh, the things that make a country like India, uh, you know, something that has been, as we talked about before, a center for civilization, and still is, but breaking you out of your shell. That so I can't. I'm not going to. India has, as you said, it's on the front line. It has two incredibly hostile neighbors. At both of which are funding and movements within India to try to break it apart from the inside. That kind of entropic warfare to try to weaken and fragment India from the inside has been ongoing since the day of modern India's birth. And the fact that it hasn't worked is a real testament to India and to the people of India and the leadership of India. I mean, it was born broken. It was born with the 500 princely states, and it wasn't really expected to survive, and it did. So I'm not in. I can't say India should do this, India should do that, but I can say that there are other countries out there like India that have been under incredible assault and who don't want to replicate either of the current dominant models, um, because they don't think it's going to serve their own people and serve their purpose. I think that the way that the U.S. specifically used to be, the term "the shining city on the hill," that beacon of democracy and freedom and stuff. That's not um, that is not a unique it is a unique country. There's no question. It really is a unique country, but those aspirations are not uniquely American. And and I think it's actually one of the reasons why Indians tend to do so well once they move to the U.S. And become American. And they're familiar as human aspirations given the chance to blossom. And the U.S. is going through some challenges at the moment, and I mean, in a very serious way. And so, there doesn't have to be one shining city on the hill. There can be multiple beacons, lights of hope, um, that can find each other. And some of them may be very small, like Micronesia in terms of population, and some of them are the biggest democracy on the planet, like India. And just because the beacon that is the United States is not spreading its flame in the way that it might have it once in the past, that doesn't mean other beacons can't combine their fires. I'm torturing the metaphor a little bit, but I think you know what I'm trying to say, and come together outside of that. Um, and it really doesn't take much. It's Pre- Prime Minister Modi going to PNG does that. Jaishankar going to Fiji does that. Working with the Maldives to get rid of some of that Chinese influence does that. What India's tried to do in Sri Lanka is trying to do that. What India's tried to do in Nepal is trying to do that. So India is already doing it. It's not doing it in the way that the United States might do it. It's much quieter, um,
Yeah.
but it's India's done it before, and hopefully this is what's going to happen again as part of a global coming together of citizens and nations that have the same threats, the same concerns, and the same aspirations.
I must say that was a tough question, and you've hit it out of the park. Because see, that's an aspiration, and I'm not talking as an interviewer or an analyst or anything like that. I was just talking as a common Indian on the street. Because when we look around, we say, "What the hell? Why aren't you? You expect so much out of us, but then you don't support us when it needs to be." Especially with Ukraine, a lot of Indians don't support the war in Ukraine. In support the Ukraine effort is because when we went through wars, there was no UN committee. I mean, 20 people died in our this thing in our borders with China. There was no UN sanctions. There was nothing, and we're militarily a smaller power than China. I mean, we have no qualms in saying that. Our inert strength is much larger. That's one of the reasons why we know we can beat back China. But militarily, numbers to numbers, that's what it is. But you've handled that question very, very nicely. I must say that. I want to
But
come back.
but but I just say I believe it. It's not rhetoric.
No, it is
Yeah,
not. It's not. That's why I'm
yeah,
saying that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And India has has more friends, I think, especially potential friends than it realizes. And it hasn't, the MEA is overstretched.
Hmm.
And it doesn't, just for example, for the Pacific Islands, a big impediment is there's no direct flights. So the people, we talked about the visa problems for Indians trying to get to the US. Pacific Islanders have it's very difficult for them to get visas to Australia and New Zealand. I mean, this is something Indians know as well. And a lot of the flight routings go through Australia and New Zealand. So that de facto controls who they can engage with, including with India. So you don't have to have the MEA carry this burden. The people recognize each other and the value of that relationship. So even just direct flights from India to hubbing out of Papua New Guinea or hubbing out of Fiji or hubbing out of Guam would make a huge difference. So that kind of, again, looking at things not through how would the West do it or how would China do it, but how can India do it, in order to find those friends who are facing those same challenges. Also, I just like to say that on the Ukraine thing, India India has not had India isn't neutral. I mean, that's sometimes presented as India being neutral, but India has been very clear. Jaishankar has been very clear. You know, Russia should not have invaded a neighbor, and and that message sometimes gets lost in all of the other politicization. When Macron went to China, he didn't make a big deal out of all of the fossil fuels, the Russian fossil fuels that the Chinese are buying. Whereas some might make a big deal out of the lesser quantities that India is buying. So it's you talked about narrative at the beginning. India's been on uh, the Indian narrative or is out of sync with the Indian reality when it comes to Ukraine, and that's also, I think, been part of the political warfare against India, and an attempt to drive a wedge between the U.S. and India. It's helpful to consistently make clear that uh, yeah, you don't average it. Nobody wants this war in Ukraine.
Well,
Yeah,
no,
yeah, nobody wants it. But and
no,
and it's not that Indians are saying generally, you know, Russia was right. It's not. That's not the message.
no.
Yeah, but it, because there's so much political warfare against India, not just trying to divide it internally, but also in the way that it's represented externally. You have to, like, for my sake, in talking to people outside, just be really clear that India's tried to make it clear that they don't think that this is a good thing, and they don't approve of Russian behavior. Yeah, but you know that if you're in India, if you're outside of India, you don't know that about India because of the political warfare against India, muddling the representation of India's position on it. So it's this is why India's in the same way that Taiwan is an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party because it shows that an Han majority country can actually do quite well out of democracy. India is this existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party because it's a billion plus people who aren't an authoritarian regime, which has people of many different faiths. You don't have to throw a million of them in jail and rip out and sell their organs, all that sort of stuff. So there's so much effort that goes into uh, the malign influence effort that goes into presenting India externally as something that it's not, so that India can be cut off from the rest of the world, cut off from potential allies, and make it feel like it's on its own, when it isn't, and it shouldn't be. But if we let them shape that international narrative, I know Indians sort of feel like often people should just know. They should just know what we've been through, and well, there are a lot of bad
People don't.
actors.
People
No,
don't.
yeah,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of bad actors who don't want people to know, who want to
Some of
distort.
them even supported what we went through. So,
Well, there's
yeah.
that too. Yeah. Sorry.
I mean,
Yeah.
Minister Jaishankar has called that out. He said that the US really wanted to do business with a dictatorship right next to us rather than a democracy. So, not our fault. I mean, we had to do what we had to do to survive, to keep up. I want to ask you one this and a last question on Taiwan. I just had you said something very interesting, the political warfare, uh, which actually I want to bring us back to China and India, and China and Taiwan, and China and Japan. It's a common narrative that you find. Political warfare against a country that you see, especially that the Chinese put out, or the Chinese conduct. If you see what happened with Taiwan, I mean, the KMT was invited, wine dined, and he said, "We're all one Chinese people," and this and that and the other. You've got a whole lot of politicians within India who say a whole lot of things. Oh, we should be friends with China and this and that. And then you've got some guys in Japan also who try to mellow the narrative. In Japan, it's a little dangerous because you'll be termed as a Chinese, this thing. But there are these voices that the Chinese are able to propagate within nations, to propagate, to put across their narrative within the country. This is one aspect of it I don't see anybody talking about. Because if the fall of Solomon's, if I may term it that way, is because of a narrative, is not because of a Chinese guy standing with a gun and trying to do something. It's the battle of narratives that needs to be fought, not the physical war in Ukraine.
Yeah. So this political warfare thing is, you know, it sounds kind of clean, like it
Yeah,
sounds, but
yeah.
it's not. People get hurt. They're dying. Political warfare just means, it's not necessarily it's not a tank, but that doesn't mean that that this battlefield is benign or not bloody. So, you know, in the case of Daniel Soudani, I mean, over 2 years ago, he's the premier Malaita province in Solomons who put out a communique. His government did, saying they didn't want any CCP linked businesses operating in their province. And the reasons he gave a bunch of reasons, but one of them was that they believe in freedom of religion, and the Chinese Communist Party was systemically atheist, and they didn't want to do business with a regime that persecutes people of faith, rips at their organs for profit. Um, and the Chinese Communist Party operatives in the country put in tens of millions of dollars to try to get him out of power in a motion of no confidence. They tried 3 times, and they succeeded on the third attempt. But during that period, he got sick, and he needed medical care outside the country. And the federal government wouldn't give him money for the medical care unless he accepted Chinese businesses in his province. And
Mhm.
he said no. So this is a man who would rather die than take Chinese money. And that almost happened. But what actually happened was an Indian, the editorial director of the Sunday Guardian, Professor M.D. Nalapat, heard about the situation, and he knows President Tsai from before she was president. I think he had hosted her when she came to India or something, and so got in touch with the president's office in Taiwan, and they got him to Taiwan for medical care. But the government of Solomons would have been very happy for him to die, and the Australians, didn't offer any funding either, didn't offer to bring it. So it's an exportation of that Chinese social credit system where you control the population through access to, um, in the case of China,
Basic
everything, transport, jobs,
medical.
yeah, medical, yeah, all of that. So it's not, when the words political warfare, they're they're that doesn't mean it's bloodless. It just means that the control and the murders uh, happen outside of a straight up military context. Um,
Yeah.
and that's happening. That's what's happened in Hong Kong, for example. It's
Mhm.
not Hong Kong now is controlled through political warfare, and that's metastasizing across the region. There's this Hong Kongization of countries that fall into the Chinese orbit, and the pattern is really similar. The free press starts to get shut down. There's the what would have been police, so a force that would investigate crime, just becomes an enforcement force for the authoritarians in power. Um, uh, Opposition is thrown in jail, all that sort of stuff. So that we are in a political warfare battlefield now, but it's killing people and societies, and that's how it kind of is slowly squeezing the life, that democracy and freedom and independence out of these nations, and pulling them into the Chinese orbit, because there's no real effective fight back in many cases.
Mhm. That's a big problem. That's what I'm talking about. It's uh, it's sort of one-sidedness, if I may. What kind of hurts me, I talk about. What doesn't hurt me, it's okay. And that's the whole thing. My last question to you is about Taiwan. The main threat towards Taiwan would be, of course, Chinese military aggressiveness. But with the election coming across, what I fear and what I fear is basically subversion. And we can see that in Taiwan to some extent. I spoke about the KMT. I spoke about that whole narrative which is within Taiwan, that you'll be safe if you don't fight, and kind of let it be. There is also another big thing which is going to come out, and which I fear the most, and I mean not fear, which I think about the most, with the way that the West has handled the war in Ukraine, has also put in question the commitment of the West to defend Taiwan. Of course, the West did have a land route into Ukraine, so they could send across so much of equipment. Uh, the Russians are a big power, you know, with all the fight that the Ukraine, and trust me, as a military observer, I've said this multiple times on my platform, the Ukrainians have fought well for their land, fantastic, but their chances of winning aren't there. With the inevitable end that it may come to, what impact does that have on the minds of the Taiwanese as an act of subversion? Because the Chinese aren't going to let it go. They're already saying it. Look at the Ukrainian cities, look at this, look at that. You
Yeah,
know,
I don't.
public opinion is dangerous.
Yeah, I don't know what the Ukraine outcome will be, and it's um, and I think you can,
Whatever the outcome will be, the
yeah.
country is destroyed. I mean, let's
It,
face it.
yeah, it well, it
Tragic.
is. Yeah, so it's suffered enormous losses,
Yeah, yeah.
and but and an outcome where it's perceived that Russia wins uh, is very dangerous globally, obviously. But to jump to the Taiwan situation, which I know a little bit better, um, there is, so the Chinese narrative is definitely to get people to think, if KMT wins, there's no war. If KMT doesn't win, there's war.
His war.
And yeah, and there's, first of all, if Taiwan is in a position to truly defend itself and to cause problems for Chinese mainland, then that then there may not be war, right? So if China thinks that it will be hurt, like those aren't, that's how China wants us to think about the situation. Vote for the KMT, or they're going to be paratroopers on your beaches.
Yeah.
So let's think about whether there's another scenario where China doesn't have that option. You know, China has a lot of vulnerabilities right now. They've managed to make us think that the the entire scope of the conflict is just the island of is Formosa, is Taiwan. They're not, we're so that constrains us from thinking, let's go after the Chinese economic system. Let's go after corruption. Let's publicize where Xi Jinping's daughter goes to school. Let's publicize, their illegal bank accounts. Let's
Yeah.
hit them where it hurts them and weaken them to the point where they actually can't go to war, where that cost benefit analysis changes. So break out of the narrative that they've created for us, where the logical conclusion is to vote for the KMT, so there's an absorption of Taiwan into China, so that there aren't paratroopers on the beaches. Well, I don't accept China's view of the world. I think that there are other things that we can do that will create a different outcome. And to do that, you have to not just think defensively, but think offensively. This is, they want to start, they're talking about starting a war. That's not acceptable to me. It's not acceptable that one country says, I want to invade another country of democratic people who are doing just fine and contributing to the global good. Taiwan, did very good work on COVID very early on. They were the first to talk about human to human transmission. They really tried to save lives. They're trying to be a force for good in the world. I don't accept that they can just be snuffed out because Beijing wants to break the first island chain and get its PLA Navy out into the larger Pacific Ocean so that it can threaten the rest of the world. That's that's not a narrative I accept. So I understand that that is the goal of the political warfare framing, but now let's think about other ways of doing it. I mean, what do you think are some of the ways that we can get that the cost to China of invading Taiwan becomes so high that maybe it doesn't do it? We could just brainstorm and come up with a bunch of different ideas.
I would firstly say just stop doing. I mean, reduce the business and please don't do any critical items which are going to hurt you. Fair enough. That's what India is doing, but try and build your own infrastructure. And I don't see the reason why Macron had to go do what he had to do, and Ursula with her role, what de-risking. I mean, that means that okay, fine, I'll not buy certain things from China, but the rest of the things I'll buy from China. That's not a problem. When the world is not unified and economic uh, things do come by, it's a very difficult proposition. But having said that, India will play a role. There's no question about it.
Yeah, that's right. And so will, the Taiwanese people, and showing them that, there are options is going to be very important for them to break out of that dichotomy, because the other thing that China does is reduce the time frame. So, so it's, are we going to be invaded or not? Not what happens if we become part of China, because they're not really talking about that. So you vote for the KMT. KMT brings Taiwan closer to China. Then what happens to Taiwan? I mean, various Chinese officials have said things like, one of them said, they're going to be re-education camps. They're going to be. It's not. It is a life of slavery. And I don't think that I was in Taiwan quite recently, actually. And I don't think that among the majority of the population, there's an understanding of what it really means. And I think that they can go to Hong Kong and take a look there, but people will say, oh, well, Hong Kong was part of China and whatever. Okay, so go to Solomon Islands and take a look at what it's like there. And
Go to
talk to,
Pakistan.
yeah, that's right. Go to Pakistan. That's right. And talk to people who are in the media, if there are any left. Talk to people in academia. Talk to people who used to have freedom and who don't anymore. And it's what's surprising to me is, we know, in 1956, when the Soviets sort of re-exerted control over Hungary, or in
Hungary.
'68 when they went into Czechoslovakia, we knew that was bad. Those are dates that we still remember because they were dates where freedom was snuffed out in those countries. We don't think of 2019 and Solomon Islands in the same way, but we should. We don't think of, just a few years before that or actually just a few years after, in Hong Kong in the same way. But that's because it was fought without the tanks. It was done through this kind of semi-political warfare way, but the outcome is the same. The outcome is the pulling into the political orbit of an authoritarian, brutal regime of countries that had, in the case of Solomon Islands, were completely independent. Or, for example, Tibet. Look what they did to Tibet. So we need to think about them in the same way that we know uh, were dates of societal capture and enslavement in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And maybe that'll help focus the mind on what's truly at risk here.
Those are, I mean, I must say, it's always wonderful talking to you, because normally we fix a subject and we always go around here and there and talk about various different things. But that's the fun of it, because you're able to actually have an open conversation without any uh, preset narratives or notes lying around the place. We're just taking one subject to the other, and it's really interesting having this particular conversation. I'd like to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Just as a wrap up, I think you've brought about some very interesting things about the narrative. By the way, if I may just mention, that's my favorite word nowadays.
It's the battle. It's the current battlefield, but it's not a. It has real world
Yeah,
consequences.
people don't understand that. People don't understand the value of information warfare, and that's something a lot of military minds would say, "Ha, theek hai, fair enough." But
Yeah.
the man on the road does not understand how this thing works. It's beyond the realm of understanding, because that again is part of information warfare, which is kept away from you. So you know how do you know about something that you just aren't supposed to know about? And
Yeah.
that's the most important thing today. It's the narratives that are driving this world. If you look at anything around us, it's just the narrative. I think, and I say this a lot on my channel whenever I talk about China, is that I wonder all this fluff about China is just another narrative uh,
I
that
think. I think. Yeah. I
the
mean. I
Chinese
think.
have built up for themselves. You never know.
I mean. Yeah. Definitely to a certain degree, but you can see I look at what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, of
Uh,
course.
yeah,
I mean, I'm
and
just saying it's a hypothetical question that comes to your mind, that what if this entire country is just fake? Their numbers are fake. Their COVID data is fake. Their food has been fake. Their milk has been fake. Their vaccines have been fake. I'd recommend people to call up Pakistan and find out what masks they got at the beginning of the pandemic. They'll tell you they were socks and underwears that were stringed up and given to them. Fake. If that's the case, I think we've become the biggest fools in the world.
yeah, unfortunately, I think that their PLA Navy equipment and Air Force equipment, because they stole most of it from
Yeah.
from real militaries, yeah, is too real. But your point is certainly valid. There's, yeah, it's not what it pretends to be, which is why seeing the French go there and buy into that narrative that it's a normal country that can be reasoned with is
Fantastic point. Exactly.
yeah.
It's not a normal country.
No, it's a very it operates a lot like a, a large organized crime organization. Um,
There's some sense in that as well. There's some rules. Here, there's no rules. I mean,
well, there's that too. I mean, it's
King wakes up on the left side of the bed. He does this. He wakes up on the right. That's fine.
yeah. I mean, he's operating within a system where power is the rule. Uh, you need, and so force and control are the currency. It's it's terrifying, actually. Yeah.
It's terrible, and that's what I've been. My entire channel is basically based on narratives, and I keep talking about this
Mhm.
all the time, that we need to think a little more before we accept anything that comes our way. And I've, as a matter of fact, said that about my own channel. Don't believe anything I say. Please research about what I'm saying, and if you find something wrong, I'm open for a discussion. Please come and do it. But people need to come into that mind frame and not saying that I saw it on YouTube, it's a good channel, he said it, so it's true. No, it's part. Everything is part of information warfare if you take it like that. This could be, if you, our conversation within China is an anti-China narrative.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, you're right. In the same, we're very careful about what where we should be, pretend to be careful about what we eat, what we put into our body. Similarly, we should be pretty careful
Absolutely.
about what we put into our heads to make sure it's not poisonous. And like you said, you do that by challenging it. And if somebody doesn't want to, I mean, I am grateful for people who disagree with me, honestly, because I definitely have a lot to learn, and that's how you learn. So, um, in the comments, put everything I got wrong so that I can can
Now,
think about it, and
let me assure you, this is a prolific conversation. It's not something that you get anywhere around the place. And I'm saying, I keep getting after you that I want to talk to you more, but you've been traveling around the place. It's very difficult to get a hold of you, but it's always lovely to talk to you and lovely to learn from you. Thank you so much, Cleo. I'm grateful that you've spent taken out the time, and I hope we can do this sometime really soon.
pleasure. Absolutely. Thank you.
Till then, thank you so much.
Thank you.